good evening. Or perhaps, for you, it is a gray, listless afternoon, the kind where the sky weeps without passion and the world outside your window seems to hold its breath. It is in such moments, isn't it, that the mind tends to wander, to stray into shadowed corners where forgotten sorrows and unspoken fears reside. My name is Eli Nightfall, and I am here to guide you into one such corner. A place called Blackwood Creek, where the rain falls a little colder and the shadows cling a little tighter. Our story tonight, Midnight's Gift, centers on Mrs. Elara Weatherly, a name that, in Blackwood Creek, was once synonymous with warm smiles and the scent of baking bread. But that was before Arthur, before the silence descended upon her small, brick by sorrowful brick, until the familiar landscape of your life is transformed into something alien, something haunted. Elara's home, once vibrant, was now a museum of loss. Arthur's reading glasses still lay on the bedside table. His worn gardening gloves hung by the back door, coated in the faint, earthy scent of soil he would never turn again. Each object was a tiny, sharp pinprick to the heart. She moved through her days in a kind of waking dream, the routines of life performed by rote, without joy, without purpose. The townsfolk of Blackwood Creek, with their well-meaning but ultimately futile condolences, had gradually retreated, leaving her to the privacy of her sorrow. And Elara, in truth, preferred it that way. Their sympathetic gazes were a constant reminder of what she had lost, their gentle words like salt in a wound that refused to heal. It was on an evening much like this, with a mournful autumn rain whispering secrets against the glass, that midnight came. Elara was staring out at her neglected garden. The roses Arthur had so lovingly tended now drooping, their petals bruised and tear-stained by the relentless drizzle. A flicker of movement at the edge of the overgrown lawn caught her eye. Sleek, black as polished jet, and unervingly silent, a cat emerged from the deeper shadows of the encroaching woods. It moved with a liquid grace, an almost arrogant confidence, as if it owned the twilight. Its eyes, when it finally turned them towards her window, were a startling, luminous green, like chips of ancient emerald lit from within. Elara had never been a cat person. Arthur had been allergic to a small, almost forgotten detail that now seemed to swell with a fresh wave of sadness. But there was something about this creature, something in its unwavering, intelligent gaze that held her captive. It sat on her porch, perfectly composed, as if it had an appointment. It did not meow, did not rub against the doorframe. It simply waited. A strange compulsion, one she couldn't quite name, drew Elara to the door. Hesitantly, she opened a crack. The rain-scented air, cold and damp, swirled into the warm stillness of her living room. The cat remained motionless, its green eyes fixed on hers. There was no fear in them, no pleading, only a calm, unnerving assessment. Well, now, Elara found herself whispering, her voice rusty from disuse. Where did you come from? The cat offered no reply, save for a slow, deliberate blink. And then, with that same fluid grace, it stepped across the threshold, into her home, into her life, as if it had always belonged there. It padded silently onto the worn Persian rug before the cold fireplace, curled itself into a perfect circle, and began to purr. The sound was unexpected, not the light, contented rumble of an ordinary house cat. This purr was deeper, a resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in the very air around it, a sound that felt ancient, almost primal. Elara found it strangely comforting, yet unsettling at the same time. It was the first sound in months that had managed to penetrate the thick fog of her grief. She named him Midnight. It seemed fitting. He was the color of the deepest night, and he had arrived in the twilight of her sorrow. In the days that followed, Midnight became a silent, watchful presence in Elara's desolate home. He rarely made a sound, save for that deep, vibrating purr. He ate sparingly of the food she provided, moved with an uncanny stealth, and spent long hours staring out the window, or sometimes, more disturbingly, staring at Elara herself, his green eyes holding an expression she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't affection. He was a living, breathing thing in a house that had become a tomb. His sleek, warm fur beneath her hesitant fingers was a tangible connection to a world that had felt distant and unreal. She began to talk to him, confiding her loneliness, her memories of Arthur, the crushing weight of her days. Midnight would listen, his head cocked, his eyes unwavering, his purr a constant. Deep thrumming in the quiet rooms. And then the gifts began. It started innocently enough, as such things often do. A small, perfectly formed but undeniably dead field mouse, left neatly on the welcome mat. Elara, though squeamish, understood it as a typical feline offering. She disposed of it with a sigh, a little flutter of something almost like gratitude for the odd gesture. A few days later, it was a bird, a little wren, its neck broken, its delicate feathers still soft. This time, a flicker of unease touched her. There was a precision to the kill, a neatness that seemed unnatural. But again, she dismissed it. Cats were hunters, after all. The third gift, however, was different. It arrived on a crisp October morning, the air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves and frost. Lying on her back porch, directly in the path she took to her wilting rose garden, was a robin, a plump, beautiful specimen, its red breast a vibrant splash of color against the gray, weathered wood. But this robin was not merely dead. Its eyes were wide, staring, and one of its wings was bent at a horrifyingly unnatural angle. There was a sense of deliberation about its placement, its presentation. A cold knot formed in Elara's stomach. This felt less like a gift and more like a statement. She stared at the lifeless bird, a wave of nausea washing over her. Midnight sat a few feet away, grooming a paw with meticulous care, his green eyes occasionally flicking towards her, then back to the robin, as if awaiting her reaction. She couldn't leave it there. With a trembling hand, Elara fetched a small trowel from the garden shed. Her hand shook as she dug a shallow grave at the edge of the rose bushes, the soil cold and damp. She gently laid the robin in the earth, its bright plumage a stark contrast to the dark soil. Covering it felt like performing a sacred, yet deeply unsettling rite. That night, Elara's sleep was troubled by strange, fleeting dreams. Whispers she couldn't quite understand, shadows that danced at the edge of her vision, and the piercing green gaze of midnight, watching her from the darkness. The following morning, Elara awoke with a sense of heavy premonition. She dressed slowly, her heart thudding with a nervous rhythm. As she descended the stairs, a sound reached her ears, a faint rhythmic tapping. Top, top, tap. It was coming from the kitchen window, the one that overlooked the rose garden. With a growing sense of dread, Elara pushed open the kitchen door. Midnight was sitting on the windowsill, looking out. But it wasn't Midnight who was making the sound. Perched on the outside of the glass, its tiny claws scrabbling for purchase, was the robin. Its red breast was still vibrant, but its feathers were matted with dirt. One wing still hung at that broken, unnatural angle, and its eyes were like polished chips of obsidian, black and depthless, reflecting the gray morning light with an empty, lifeless sheen. It turned its head, a jerky, unnatural movement, and fixed those terrible eyes on Elara. Then it opened its beak, and a sound emerged. Not a chirp, not the sweet song of a living bird. It was a dry, guttural click, a horrifying, distorted parody of life. Elara Weatherly stood frozen, a silent scream trapped in her throat, the trowel falling from her numb fingers to clatter loudly on the kitchen floor. The robin clicked again, its obsidian eyes unwavering, and beside it, on the windowsill, Midnight began to purr. That deep, resonant thrum that now, for the first time, sounded not like comfort, but like a dark and terrible promise. The first gift had been returned, and it was only the beginning. Chapter 1. Whispers in the Widow's Weeds. The silence in Elara Weatherly's house was a living entity, thick and cloying. punctuated only by the mournful tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that seemed to measure not time, but the slow, agonizing decay of her spirit. Grief had hollowed her, leaving behind an echoing emptiness where Joy and Arthur once resided. Blackwood Creek, her home for 40 years, felt alien, its familiar lanes and quaint storefronts now viewed through a perpetual veil of sorrow. The townsfolk, once friends, now offered pitying glances and hushed condolences that pricked at her raw nerves like tiny needles. She preferred the solitude, the quiet companionship of her memories, however painful they might be. Her days were a monotonous cycle of staring out windows, rereading Arthur's favorite books until the words blurred, and tending to the remnants of a life that felt irrevocably over. The world outside her picket fence continued, oblivious to the chasm Arthur's passing had torn in her existence. Autumn was bleeding into the landscape, painting the maple trees along Hemlock Lane in hues of fiery crimson and melancholic gold, a beautiful, cruel reminder of the relentless march of seasons, of life moving on without him. It was during one such twilight, when the dying sun cast long, skeletal shadows across her overgrown lawn, that he appeared. Elara was in the sunroom, a place Arthur had built with his own hands, now filled with wilting spider plants and dust motes dancing in the fading light. A flicker of movement at the edge of the woods, with a property line blurred into untamed wilderness, drew her gaze. A cat, sleek, black as a moonless night, moving with an almost supernatural grace. It paused, one paw delicately lifted, its head tilted as if listening to some unheard call. Then, with a deliberate, unhurried gait, it padded across the dew-damp grass towards her house. Elara watched, a strange stillness settling over her. She wasn't a cat person. Arthur's mild allergy had precluded pets of the feline persuasion. Yet, there was something about this creature, an undeniable magnetism in its silent approach. It stopped at the French doors, its form a perfect silhouette against the bruised purple of the evening sky. And then it looked at her. Its eyes, even in the dimming light, seemed to glow with an internal luminescence, a startling, intelligent green, like chips of jade lit by an unseen flame. They held no fear, no deference, only a calm, unwavering scrutiny that sent an odd shiver down Elara's spine. A sensation not entirely unpleasant, more akin to a forgotten nerve being gently prodded awake. The cat didn't meow, didn't rub against the glass, didn't make any of the usual feline entreaties. It simply sat, an obsidian statue, its gaze locked with hers. A peculiar compulsion, a stirring of something other than sorrow, prompted Elara to rise. Her joints ached in protest, unused to such sudden movements. She unlatched the French doors, the cool evening air, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, sighing into the stale warmth of the sunroom. The cat remained perfectly still, its green eyes never leaving hers. "Well now," Elara heard herself say, her voice a dry whisper, raspy from disuse. "You're a bold one, aren't you?" As if her words were a signal, the cat flowed through the opening, a shadow detaching itself from the greater darkness. It didn't brush against her legs or offer any sign of greeting. Instead, it padded silently into the center of the room, surveyed its surroundings with an air of regal appraisal, and then, with a sigh that seemed almost human, settled onto the worn chintz cushion of Arthur's favorite armchair. It curled into a neat, black circle, tucked its nose under its tail, and began to purr. A low, hypnotic hum that vibrated in Elara's own chest. It was strangely comforting, yet held an undercurrent of something ancient, something primal. She decided to call him Midnight. It seemed to suit his code and the hour of his arrival into the twilight of her life. Midnight became an unobtrusive fixture. He demanded little, ate sparingly of the canned tuna she offered, and spent most of his days either sleeping in Arthur's chair or sitting on windowsills, staring out at the world with that same unnerving, intelligent gaze. Sometimes, Elara would catch him watching her, his green eyes glowing in the dim light, and she would feel that same peculiar shiver, a sense of being observed, analyzed, by a mind far older and more knowing than any mere animal's. The first gift arrived a week later. Elara found it on the back doorstep when she went to retrieve the morning paper, which lay unread most days. A small, perfectly formed field mouse, its neck broken with an almost surgical precision, lay neatly arranged on the welcome mat. Its tiny paws were tucked beneath it, its eyes closed as if in peaceful slumber. Elara, despite a natural aversion to rodents, dead or alive, felt a strange pang. It was, she supposed, a typical feline offering, a token of what? Affection? Esteem? She couldn't quite say. Midnight sat nearby, meticulously grooming a paw, his demeanor one of placid indifference. Yet Elara sensed an air of expectation. With a sigh, she fetched a trowel and a small cardboard box from a shed. She buried the mouse at the far end of the garden, under the old oak tree whose leaves were now a brittle, rust-colored carpet on the ground. As she patted down the earth, she felt a strange sense of ritual, of performing some ancient, unspoken rite. Midnight watched the proceedings from a porch, his green eyes narrowed, his tail twitching almost imperceptibly. He made no sound, offered no further acknowledgement. The next offering came 3 days later. This time it was a sparrow. An unsettling prickle of unease traced its way down Elara's spine. She buried the sparrow next to the mouse, the small mound of fresh earth a stark contrast to the dying foliage around it. She found herself talking to Midnight that evening, her voice soft in the lamplit silence of the living room. "You mustn't bring me these things, Midnight," she chided gently, stroking his sleek, cool fur. It's not nice." Midnight merely blinked slowly, his deep purr a constant vibration against her hand, his eyes glowing with that inscrutable, ancient light. He seemed to understand, yet not to care. The robin appeared on a crisp, clear morning, the kind where the autumn air felt sharp and clean in the lungs, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Elara had decided to attempt some light gardening, a task she'd neglected since Arthur's passing. His roses, once his pride and joy, were now a tangled, thorny mess, their blooms faded and shriveled. As she stepped onto the back porch, her gaze fell upon it. Lying directly in her path, a splash of incongruous, vibrant red against the weathered gray boards, was a robin. It was a magnificent specimen, plump and healthy-looking, its breast an almost shockingly bright crimson. But it was undeniably, irrevocably dead. One wing was splayed at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, wide and unblinking, stared up at the pristine blue sky with a glassy, vacant intensity. A wave of genuine nausea, cold and clammy, washed over Elara. This was different. There was a deliberateness to this, a theatricality that chilled her to the bone. The mouse and the sparrow had been unsettling. This felt like a message, a macabre declaration. Midnight was perched on the porch railing, a sleek black sentinel, observing her reaction with an unnerving stillness. His usual air of aloof indifference was replaced by a focused intensity, his green eyes fixed on her face. Elara felt a tremor run through her. She couldn't leave it there. The sight of it, so vibrant yet so lifeless, was an affront to the beautiful morning. With trembling hands, she retrieved the trowel, its metal cool against her clammy skin. She chose a spot beneath the largest, most neglected rose bush, its thorns like grasping claws. The earth was cold and compacted, resisting her efforts. As she dug, she could feel Midnight's gaze on her back, a palpable pressure. She gently lifted the robin. Its body was still slightly warm, its feathers soft beneath her hesitant touch. A profound sadness, mixed with a burgeoning, indefinable fear, welled up within her. She laid the bird in the shallow grave, its crimson breast a stark wound against the dark soil. As she covered it, a single, perfectly formed tear escaped her eye and splashed onto the disturbed earth. She didn't know why she was crying for a dead bird, a bird brought by a cat she barely knew. Perhaps she was crying for Arthur, for the life they had shared, for the roses that were dying, for the suffocating loneliness that had become her constant companion. The following morning, Elara awoke to a preternatural stillness. The usual early morning chorus of birdsong from the garden was absent. A heavy, oppressive silence pressed in on the house, broken only by the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock. A sense of unease, vague but potent, had settled over her during a restless night filled with fragmented, disturbing dreams, flashes of obsidian eyes, the whisper of feathers, and the deep, resonant purr of midnight echoing in empty rooms. She descended the stairs, her hand trailing along the polished banister, each step creaking like a mournful sigh. As she reached the kitchen, a faint, rhythmic sound reached her ears. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, almost subliminal, but insistent. It seemed to be coming from the window above the sink, the one that offered a clear view of Arthur's rose garden. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs with a slow, heavy dread. She pushed open the kitchen door, her breath catching in her throat. Midnight was sitting on the sill, his back to her, intently focused on something outside. The tapping came again, louder this time, accompanied by a faint, scratching sound. Elara moved forward, her feet leaden, a terrible premonition coiling in her stomach. She peered over Midnight's sleek black head through the slightly grimy glass. And then she saw it. Perched precariously on the narrow outer ledge, its tiny claws scrabbling for purchase on the painted wood, was the robin. Its crimson breast, now flecked with damp earth, was still shockingly vibrant. Its wing, the one that had been splayed at that horrifying angle, remained grotesquely twisted. But it was its eyes that seized Elara's gaze and held it captive in a grip of icy horror. They were no longer the vacant, glassy orbs of a dead creature. They were now like polished chips of obsidian, black, depthless, and gleaming with a cold, unholy light. The robin turned its head, a jerky, puppet-like movement, and fixed those terrible, knowing eyes directly on Elara. It opened its beak, and a sound emerged, not the sweet, melodious chirp of a living bird, but a dry, guttural click, a grotesque parody of birdsong, a sound that seemed to scrape against the very fabric of the morning. Elara stumbled back, a strangled cry dying in her throat. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling the scream that clawed its way up from the depths of her terror. The world tilted, the familiar lines of her kitchen wavering as if seen through water. The robin clicked again, its obsidian eyes unblinking, its gaze pinning her like an insect. Beside it, on the windowsill, Midnight began to purr. That deep, resonant thrum filled the sudden, ringing silence in Elara's ears, no longer a sound of comfort, but a chilling accompaniment to the abomination on her window ledge. It was a sound of dark satisfaction, of ancient power, of a horror just beginning to unfurl. The robin, the thing that had been a robin, tilted its head again, and with another dry, rasping click, it hopped from the ledge, took to the air with a stiff, unnatural flutter of its one good wing, and flew towards the blighted rose bushes, disappearing among the thorns and dying leaves. Elara Weatherly sank to the cold linoleum floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. The image of those obsidian eyes burned into her mind. The gift had been returned, and it was never the same. Chapter 2. The Crimson Bloom. The days that followed the robin's horrifying return were steeped in a surreal, nerve-shredding tension. Elara moved through her house like a ghost, starting at every unexpected sound, her gaze constantly drawn to the windows, half expecting to see those polished obsidian eyes staring back at her. The reanimated bird had taken up residence in Arthur's blighted rose garden. She would see it sometimes, a flicker of unnaturally bright crimson amidst the dying browns and grays, perched stiffly on a thorny cane or pecking at the damp earth with jerky, unnatural movements. It never sang. The only sound it made was that dry, guttural click a sound that seemed to echo the desiccated state of its stolen life. It hunted insects with a predatory focus that was chillingly efficient, though Elara couldn't imagine it needed sustenance. There was a cold, alien intelligence in its obsidian gaze now, a terrifying sentience that had not been there in life. It watched her sometimes when she dared to venture into the garden, its head cocked, its movements unervingly precise. Midnight, throughout all of this, remained an enigma. He would often sit by the kitchen window, watching the reanimated robin with an air of quiet contemplation, his deep purr a constant, unsettling hum. He seemed to take a proprietary satisfaction in its grotesque existence, as if it were a favored, if flawed, creation. Elara tried to rationalize. Perhaps she had imagined it. Perhaps the grief, the isolation, had finally fractured her sanity. But the robin was undeniably there, a grotesque parody of life flitting amongst the decaying roses. She considered calling someone Dr. Albright, perhaps, or even Sheriff Brody. But what would she say? My cat brought a dead bird back to life, and now it's living in my garden, clicking at me with eyes like polished stones. They would think her mad. Insidious dread. Sleep offered no escape, her nights plagued by visions of obsidian eyes and the dry, rasping click of the undead bird, all underscored by midnight's deep, unwavering purr. She began to feel as if she were trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't awaken, a quiet, personal horror playing out against the backdrop of her mundane, sorrowful life. One crisp late October morning, about a week after the robin's return, Elara noticed something else amiss, something that sent a fresh jolt of unease through her already frayed nerves. Arthur's prize-winning white roses, the snow queens he had babied and fussed over for years, had been particularly hard hit by an early, unseasonable frost. Their delicate blooms had turned a bruised, mournful brown, their petals limp and lifeless. She had mourned them as yet another small death, another beautiful thing lost to the encroaching decay of her world. But now, as she stared out the kitchen window, her gaze fixed on the patch where the snow queens grew, she saw a startling splash of color. Not white, but a deep, vibrant, almost unnatural crimson. Her breath hitched. Hesitantly, she pulled on her gardening gloves, Arthur's gloves, still carrying the faint, earthy scent of him, and stepped out onto the porch. The reanimated robin, perched on a nearby trellis, turned its obsidian eyes towards her, emitting a soft, dry click. Elara ignored it, her attention fixed on the roses. As she drew closer, the transformation became even more apparent and more horrifying. The snow queen bushes, which should have been dormant, if not entirely dead, were not only blooming, but blooming with an alien vigor. The flowers were enormous, their petals thick and velvety, the color of freshly spilled blood. They were undeniably beautiful in a grotesque, unsettling way, but they were not snow queens. And it wasn't just the color. The thorns, she noticed with a sickening lurch, were longer, sharper, almost needle-like, curving wickedly from the stems. The leaves, too, were a darker, glossier green than she remembered, with an almost leathery texture. The air around them hummed with a strange, almost palpable energy, a faint, metallic scent mingling with the usual earthy aroma of the garden. And then she saw him. Midnight. He was curled at the base of the most vibrant crimson bloom, his black fur a stark contrast against the blood-red petals. He was purring, that deep, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate through the very soil. He opened one luminous green eye, looked at Elara, then at the crimson rose above him, and gave a slow, deliberate blink, as if to say, "See what I can do." A cold dread, sharp and piercing, speared through Elara. The cat. It had to be the cat. First the robin, now the roses. It was as if Midnight's very presence, his unnatural power, was seeping into the world around him, twisting and corrupting, reanimating and transforming. These weren't Arthur's roses. These were something else, something born of shadow and unnatural life. Their vibrant beauty a terrifying mockery of nature. The crimson blooms seemed to thrive in the very spot where midnight most often napped, their roots drawing nourishment from soil tainted by his dark influence. Elara backed away slowly, her heart pounding, the sight of the blood-red roses and the purring black cat burning itself into her memory. The reanimated robin clicked softly from the trellis, its obsidian eyes gleaming. Blackwood Creek, her quiet, familiar town, was becoming a stage for a horror she could neither comprehend nor escape, a horror that was blooming, quite literally, in her own backyard. The whispers in the widow's weeds were no longer just the rustle of autumn leaves. They were the dry clicks of an undead bird in the silent. Chapter 3. Scratches from the Past. The crimson roses thrived with an unnatural, almost aggressive vitality, their blood-red blooms a constant, garish reminder of midnight's insidious influence. Elara avoided that corner of the garden, her gaze skittering away whenever it inadvertently landed on their vibrant, disturbing beauty. The reanimated robin, too, seemed drawn to them, often perching amongst their thorny canes, its obsidian, eyes gleaming amidst the scarlet petals, a grotesque jewel in a monstrous crown. Elara's days became a tightrope walk of feigned normalcy, her nights a battleground of sleeplessness and horrifying conjecture. She found herself meticulously cleaning, scrubbing away invisible taints, as if she could somehow wash away the creeping horror that had infiltrated her home. The silence of the house, once a mournful companion, now felt charged, expectant. She started talking to herself more, her whispers echoing in the empty rooms, a desperate attempt to fill the void with something other than the dry sea. Licks from the garden and the deep, unsettling purr of the black cat, who now seemed to hold her captive in a web of supernatural dread. Her thoughts, inevitably, began to drift further into the past, seeking refuge in memories that predated Arthur, predated the suffocating grief. She found herself reminiscing about her childhood, Abu, the rambling old farmhouse where she grew up, about her parents, long gone. And with those memories came Pip. Pip, her beloved childhood terrier, a scruffy, energetic bundle of unwavering loyalty in début de la fiction. He had been her constant companion, her confidant, her furry shadow for 12 happy years, before old age had finally claimed him. The ache of his loss, though decades old, surfaced with a surprising, poignant sharpness. She remembered his joyful barks, the feel of his rough fur beneath her small hands, the way he would cock his head, his intelligent brown eyes full of an almost human understanding. She still had his favorite toy, a battered, much-chewed rubber ball, tucked away in a small, cedar-lined memory box in the attic, along with faded photographs and other siege. Ildhood treasures. The thought of it, of that tangible link to a happier, more innocent time, brought a fleeting, bittersweet comfort. One rainy afternoon, seeking a distraction from the oppressive atmosphere downstairs, Elara found herself drawn to the attic. The air up there was cold and still, thick with the scent of dust and aged wood. Cobwebs, intricate and undisturbed, draped the forgotten relics of her past like ghostly shrouds. She located the memory box easily, tucked beneath a moth-eaten quilt, sitting on an old steamer trunk. She carefully lifted the lid. The scent of cedar and old paper wafted out, a nostalgic perfume. There were her father's reading glasses, her mother's favorite cameo brooch, a lock of her own bee, a by hair tied with a faded blue ribbon. And there, nestled amongst the fragile remnants of her childhood, was Pip's ball. It was a dull, faded red, pockmarked with countless tiny teeth marks, a Tesdam. Into years of enthusiastic play, a wave of tenderness, so profound it brought tears to her eyes, washed over Elara. She picked it up, its familiar, worn texture surprisingly comforting in her tremble. ING hand. For a moment, she was a child again, running through sun-dappled fields, Pip a joyful, barking blur at her heels. The attic, with its dusty silence and its tangible memories, felt like a sand. Turi, a temporary reprieve from the encroaching horror downstairs. She lost track of time, sifting through the remnants of her past, a melancholic smile playing on her lips. When she finally descended the attic stairs, leaving the memory box open on the trunk, the house felt colder, the silence more profound. Midnight was nowhere to be seen. This was unusual. He rarely SD. Raid Far. She called his name, her voice echoing unervingly in the empty hallway. No response. A flicker of unease, sharp and sudden, pricked at her. She searched the downstairs rooms, her anxiety mounting with each empty space. The kitchen, the living room, Arthur's study, all deserted. The back door was closed and locked. He couldn't have gotten out. Then a faint sound from above. A soft rhythmic thudding from the attic. Her blood ran cold. With a sense of profound dread, Elara climbed the stairs again, her heart hammering against her ribs. The attic door, which she distinctly remembered, closing, was now slightly ajar. Peeking through the narrow opening, she saw him. Midnight was curled inside the open memory box, nestled amongst her childhood treasures, his sleek black body almost overflowing its confines. He wasn't sleeping. He was intensely focused on Pip's old rubber ball, which lay between his paws. He nudged it with his nose, then patted it gently with a velvet paw. His claws carefully retracted. He seemed to be studying it, absorbing its essence, his luminous green eyes glowing with that familiar, unsettling intelligence. He stayed there for hours, a silent black S, Intinel guarding the faded remnants of her past, his deep purr low, almost inaudible vibration in the dusty stillness. Elara watched him for a long time, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. WH. How was he doing? What new horror was he contemplating? The sight of him there, amongst her most cherished memories, felt like a desecration, a violation. She finally retreated, unable to bear the sigh any longer, leaving him to his strange, silent vigil. The scratching started just after midnight. Elara was in bed, though sleep was a distant, unattainable shore. She lay rigid in the darkness, listening to the relentless ticking of the clock, the sigh of the wind in the eaves, every nerve ending screaming with a heightened, fearful awareness. At first, it was so faint she thought she'd imagined it, a trick of the wind or the settling of the old hoe. Essie, a soft, hesitant, intermittent scratching, like tiny claws on wood. It seemed to be coming from the back door. Her heart leaped in her throat. The reanimated Robin? Had it somehow learned to ope indoors? But the sound was different, heavier, more deliberate. Scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch. Midnight, who had eventually emerged from the attic and taken up his usual spot at the foot of her bed, lifted his head, his ears swiveling towards the sound, his green eyes glowing eerily in the darkness, fixed on the bedroom door. He emitted a low, almost inaudible growl, a sound Elara had never heard him make before, a sound that vibrated with a primal, possessive menace. Trembling, Elara slid out of bed, her bare feet cold on the wooden floor. She crept to the window, her fingers fumbling with the edge of the curtain. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, casting the back garden in an almost impenetrable darkness. She could see nothing, but the scratching continued, more insistent now. Scratch, scrape, scratch. A terrible, impossible thought began to form in her mind, a thought so monstrous she tried to push it away, but it clung there, cold and terrifying. She had to. No, she had to see. Steeling herself, she crept from the bedroom. Midnight, a silent, black shadow at her heels. Down the stairs, each creak of the floorboards amplified in the suffocating silence. The back door. The scratching was louder here, undeniably real. Her hand, slick with sweat, reached for the doorknob. She hesitated, a wave of pure, unadulterated terror washing over her. What if her most cherished memory, her beloved Pip, had been defiled, resurrected by the same dark power that had twisted the robin and the roses? Taking a deep, ragged breath, she turned the knob and pulled the door open a crack. For a moment, nothing. Only the cold night air, damp and smelling of rain and decaying leaves. Then, a shape emerged from the deepest shadows of the porch. It was low, too. The ground, Sujur Jaldi Sijijwadi, on all fours, its movements stiff, hesitant, almost apologetic. It moved into the faint light spilling from the doorway. A dog, a small terrier. Its fur was matted indeed patchy, caked with dirt and what looked like grave mold. One ear was torn, hanging limply. One eye was clouded, milky white and vacant. The other was a deep, soulful brown. NTLY, horrifyingly familiar. Its markings, though obscured by filth and decay, were undeniably, unmistakably Pip's. It whimpered, a soft, wet, gurgling sound that was a grotesque parody of the joyful bark she remembered. It took a hesitant step towards her, then another, its body swaying slightly, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. It was Pip, her Pip, returned from a decades-old grave, a grotesque, silent parody of the beloved companion she had mourned so deeply. Midnight, beside her, let out a soft, almost satisfied hiss, his tail lashing once, sharply. Elara stared, her mind reeling. A scream trapped in her throat, the rubber ball she had clutched in the attic falling from her numb fingers to bounce with a sickening thud on the porch steps. Chapter 4. The Unseen Watcher. The reanimated Pip was a constant, unnerving presence, a grotesque shadow puppetry of the dog Elara had loved. He, or it, rarely made a sound beyond that soft, wet, gurgling whimper that seemed to catch in its decaying throat. There were no joyful barks, no enthusiastic tail wags, no familiar click of claws on the wooden floors. Instead, it moved with a slow, almost painful deliberation, its limbs stiff, its balance precarious. The matted fur, caked with grave dirt and something darker, something that looked like dried ichor, shed in clumps, revealing patches of gray, desiccated skin beneath. The milky, clouded eye stared blankly ahead, unseeing, but the other, that one disturbingly familiar brown eye, followed Elara wherever she went. It would sit for hours in the hallway or by the hearth, its head cocked in that old, familiar way, but the spark of life, the vibrant spirit that had defined her Pip, was gone. This was merely a shell, an echo, animated by some dark, unknown force, a terrifying testament to Midnight's insidious power. Elara found herself trapped in a waking nightmare. She couldn't bring herself to touch the creature, the thought of that cold, decaying fur beneath her fingers sending shudders of revulsion through her. Yet, a perverse sliver of her grief-stricken heart ached with a terrible, conflicted pity. This abomination wore the face of her beloved companion. She left food out, scraps of meat, a bowl of water, but the reanimated Pip showed no interest. It didn't seem to need sustenance or comfort or affection. It only needed a watch. Its presence filled the house with a chilling, oppressive silence, broken only by its occasional soft, wet gurgles and the constant, deep purr of Midnight, who seemed to regard this new addition to their macabre household with a kind of detached, proprietary interest. The black cat would sometimes sit near the reanimated terrier, grooming itself placidly, its luminous green eyes flicking between Elara and the grotesque parody of her childhood pet, as if observing a particularly fascinating, if unsettling, experiment. The reanimated robin, too, seemed to acknowledge Pip's arrival, its dry clicks from the garden sometimes sounding almost like a distorted, mocking greeting when the decaying dog was near a window. The stench of decay, faint at first, began to permeate the house, a cloying, sweetish odor that clung to the curtains and settled in the upholstery, a constant reminder of the unnatural presence within her walls. Elara scrubbed and aired out the rooms obsessively, but the smell lingered, a phantom miasma of death and corruption. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind, sent jolts of adrenaline through her. She would lie awake for hours, staring into the darkness. The image of Pip's one good, watching eye burned into her retinas. She started to leave lights on, a childish defense against the encroaching shadows, but the reanimated dog seemed indifferent to light or dark, its silent vigil unwavering, as if drawing nourishment from the increasing despair within the house. Their thorns seemed longer, sharper, their scent more metallic, more unsettling. Elara felt her sanity fraying, stretched taut like an old, brittle string ready to snap at any moment. She was living with the dead, an unwilling custodian of horrors conjured by a cat with eyes like emerald chips and a purr that echoed the abyss. One bleak afternoon, as a cold, sleety rain lashed against the windows, Elara was staring out at the desolate, gray landscape of her backyard when she saw Midnight on the porch. He was crouched low, his body tense, his gaze fixed on something at the edge of the woods. Then, with a sudden lightning-fast pounce, he darted into the undergrowth. A moment later, he emerged, dragging a limp, furry form behind him. A squirrel. Its bushy tail was matted with blood, its small body contorted in the unnatural stillness of death. Midnight dragged it onto the porch, directly beneath the kitchen window, and dropped it with an air of grim satisfaction. He looked up at Elara, a low, guttural meow rumbling in his chest, his green eyes gleaming with a feral triumph. Elara's stomach churned. Not another one. Please, not another one. The thought of yet another reanimated creature, another grotesque parody of life, joining her horrific menagerie was more than she could bear. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her. She had to do something. She couldn't let this happen again. Before Midnight could begin whatever dark ritual brought these creatures back, Elara acted, galvanized by a desperate, reckless courage. She threw open the back door, grabbed the hearth shovel that leaned against the wall, and rushed out onto the porch. Midnight, startled by her sudden, aggressive movement, hissed, arching his back, his fur bristling. Elara ignored him. With a cry that was half sob, half snarl, she scooped up the dead squirrel with the shovel. Its small, lifeless body was surprisingly heavy. "No," she screamed, her voice raw, addressing the cat, the sky, the uncaring universe. "No more." She turned and fled, stumbling through the rain-swept garden, past the jeering crimson roses, past the reanimated robin that watched her with its obsidian eyes, past the silent, watching form of the decaying Pip, who had shambled to the edge of the porch, its one good eye fixed on her. She ran, heedless of the thorny branches that tore at her clothes, of the cold rain that soaked her to the skin. She ran until she reached the dense, tangled woods at the far end of her property, a place she usually avoided, a place where the sunlight rarely penetrated the thick canopy. There, panting, her lungs burning, she dug a hasty, shallow grave with the shovel, the wet earth yielding easily. She dropped the squirrel's body into the hole and quickly covered it, piling leaves and branches on top, hoping to conceal it, to protect it from Midnight's unholy power. She didn't know if it would work. She didn't know if distance mattered to whatever dark magic the cat possessed. But she had to try. As she straightened up, a sense of profound exhaustion, both physical and emotional, washed over her. She leaned against a tree, the rough bark pressing in her back, and sobbed, great, racking sobs of despair and terror. She returned to the house hours later, drenched, shivering, and emotionally drained. Midnight was sitting on the porch, grooming himself with an air of offended dignity. But he made no move to follow her when she went inside. The reanimated Pip was in his usual spot in the hallway, his one good eye fixing on her with that same unnerving, vacant stare. Elara collapsed into Arthur's armchair, the one Midnight had claimed, a bone-deep weariness settling over her. For a while, there was a semblance of peace, a fragile, temporary truce in her ongoing war with the supernatural. The reanimated squirrel did not return that night, nor the next morning. A sliver of hope, faint but persistent, began to flicker within Elara. Perhaps she had thwarted him. Perhaps, By removing the creature from his immediate vicinity, she had broken the spell. But the hope was short-lived. The following afternoon, as she was listlessly stirring a pot of soup on the stove, a faint scratching at the back door sent a fresh wave of icy dread through her. Not again. Please, not again. With trembling legs, she forced herself to the door and peered through the small glass pane. There, on the welcome mat, was the squirrel. Or what had been the squirrel. It was mangled, its fur caked with mud and what looked like dry blood. One of its legs was twisted at a horrifying angle, and its bushy tail was half missing, as if torn away. But was undeniably, horrifyingly alive, or at least animated. Its small, black eyes, no longer bright and intelligent, but dull and lifeless, glowed with a faint feral light. It twitched, its movements jerky and unnatural, and tried to drag itself forward, its one good front paw scrabbling at the wood. Midnight appeared from around the side of the house, a low, satisfied purr rumbling in his chest. He nudged the grotesque creature with his nose, then looked up at Elara, his green eyes gleaming with a chilling, triumphant malice. Elara stumbled back from the door, a choked sob escaping her lips. There was no escape. Midnight's power was not bound by distance, or by her pathetic attempts at intervention. He was the master of this gruesome puppet show, and she, and everything she had ever loved or known, were merely his playthings. The unseen watcher was no longer just Pip. It was every shadow, every resurrected horror, and the dark, ancient intelligence that gleamed in the eyes of her black cat. Chapter 5. Shadows on Hemlock Lane. The reanimated squirrel, a grotesque, twitching horror, joined the silent, watchful assembly. Elara no longer tried to dispose of them. The futility was a crushing weight. She merely endured, a prisoner in her own home, surrounded by these perversions of life. The house on Hemlock Lane, once a place of warmth and memory, now felt like a charnel house, a mausoleum where the dead walked and watched with empty eyes. The faint, sweetish odor of decay grew stronger, a constant. The gurgling, one-eyed Pip and the mangled, twitching squirrel. She moved through her days in a fog of dread and exhaustion, the line between waking and nightmare blurring into an indistinguishable haze. Her isolation, however, was not as complete as she believed. Blackwood Creek, like most small towns, was a place where secrets had a short lifespan, where unexplained deviations from a norm were quickly noted and dissected in hushed tones over coffee at the diner or across garden fences. Elara's increasingly reclusive behavior, her neglected garden now dominated by those unnaturally vibrant, blood-red roses, had not gone unnoticed. Mr. Henderson, her elderly, somewhat officious neighbor from across Hemlock Lane, was a man who prided himself on knowing the goings-on of his small corner of the world. He was a widower himself, a creature of habit, his days punctuated by meticulous gardening, brisk walks, and keen observation. He had been concerned about Elara since Arthur's passing, of course, offering gruff but well-meaning condolences and the occasional casserole. But lately, his concern had begun to curdle into something more akin to suspicion. One unseasonably mild November morning, as Elara was listlessly sweeping the porch, a futile attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy, Mr. Henderson appeared at her gate. He was a stooped figure, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. Elara's heart sank. She had been dreading this, the inevitable intrusion of the outside world into her carefully contained horror. She forced a weak smile. "Mr. Henderson, good morning." He pushed open the gate and walked slowly up her path, his gaze sweeping over the overgrown lawn, lingering on the vibrant, almost obscene crimson of the roses. "Those roses of yours, Elara." He began, his brow furrowed. "An unholy color, if you ask me. Never seen snow queens turn that shade. Arthur would be turning in his grave." Elara flinched inwardly at the casual mention of Arthur's grave. "Just a new fertilizer I'm trying, Mr. Henderson," she lied, her voice thin. He didn't look convinced. "Be that as it may," he continued, lowering his voice, "I've been seeing things. Strange things. Around your property. Late at night. A chill snaked down Elara's spine. Things, she echoed, trying to keep her tone light. What sort of things? Shadows, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Darting shadows. Too quick for a fox, too unnatural for a raccoon. And sounds. Sounds. Like something dragging. Elara's mind flew to the reanimated squirrel, its mangled body scraping across the porch, to Pip, his stiff, uneven gait. She swallowed hard. Probably just the wind, Mr. Henderson, or stray animals. This old house makes all sorts of noises. He peered at her sharply. Perhaps, but I also saw that black cat of yours. The new one. Saw it watching my prize rooster, Reginald, just yesterday. Staring at him with a look that fair curdled my blood. Elara struggled to maintain her composure, her forced smile feeling brittle. About to shatter. The thought of midnight, turning his attention to Mr. Henderson's beloved Reginald, sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Midnight wouldn't hurt a fly, Mr. Henderson, she said. What in tarnation was that? Elara's blood ran cold. The reanimated robin. Oh, probably just a cricket, she stammered, her mind racing. They get loud this time of year. He gave her a long, searching look, his suspicion now palpable. Crickets don't sound like that in November, Elara. He grunted, then seemed to make a decision. Well, you keep an eye on things. And keep that cat of yours away from my Reginald. He's a champion, you know. Best in the county. With a curt nod, he turned and stumped back down the path, leaving Elara trembling on the porch. The weight of his unspoken accusations pressing down on her. The encounter left her shaken. The outside world was beginning to encroach, its mundane concerns threatening to collide with the secret horrors she harbored. She redoubled her efforts to keep the reanimated creatures hidden, a near impossible task. The reanimated squirrel, in particular, was difficult to control, its twitching, erratic movements often leading it to the edges of the property. She had a close call a few days later when she saw it. From an upstairs window, Elara was awakened in the pre-dawn gloom by a frantic, terrified squawking, followed by a series of guttural, predatory snarls. The sounds were coming from Mr. Henderson's yard. Her heart leaped in her throat. Reginald! She rushed to her window, her hands clammy, her breath catching in her chest. In the dim, gray light, she could see a scene of carnage unfolding. A sleek, black shape, midnight, unmistakably, was locked in a vicious struggle with a flurry of white feathers. Mr. Henderson's prize-winning rooster. The fight was brutal, swift, and horrifyingly one-sided. A final, strangled cry, and then silence, broken only by midnight's low, satisfied growls. Elara watched in frozen horror as midnight dragged the limp, lifeless form of Reginald across the lawn, towards the hedge, towards her property. He slipped through a gap in the overgrown bushes and disappeared into the shadows of her own yard. Later that morning, a distraught Mr. Henderson appeared at her door, his face pale, his eyes blazing with a mixture of grief and fury. He's gone, he choked out, his voice trembling. Reginald, something got him, tore him to pieces. I told you, Elara. I told you about those shadows, about that vicious black cat of yours. Elara could only stammer a weak, inadequate expression of sympathy, her guilt a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. She denied any knowledge, any involvement of midnight, but her denials sounded hollow even to her own ears. Mr. Henderson wasn't fooled. There's a new predator in Blackwood Creek, Elara, he said, his voice grim, his gaze like chips of ice. A vicious, unnatural predator, and I think I know where it dens. He stared pointedly at her house, at the blood-red roses blooming with obscene vibrancy, at the shadows that seemed to cling to her windows even in the bright morning light. Then, he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, a broken man. The lines had been drawn. The shadows on Hemlock Lane were no longer just fleeting glimpses. They were coalescing, taking form, and the mundane world, with its ordinary griefs and suspicions, was beginning to press in on Elara's carefully guarded nightmare. Chapter 6, The Attic Menagerie. The accusation in Mr. Henderson's eyes, the thinly veiled threat in his voice, spurred Elara into a new, desperate phase of containment. The reanimated creatures, her grotesque, unwilling family, could no longer be allowed even the limited freedom of her blighted garden. The risk of discovery was too great. The attic, that dusty, forgotten space filled with the ghosts of her past, seemed the only viable prison. It was remote, rarely visited, its single small window overlooking the densest part of the woods. Away from prying eyes, the decision, once made, filled her with a grim, almost surgical resolve, though the thought of what she was about to do sent waves of revulsion and a strange, twisted pity through her. These abominations were, after all, echoes of things she had once cherished, or at least things that had once been innocent. The task of luring and coercing her unholy menagerie into the attic was a harrowing ordeal, a descent into a personal hell she could never have imagined. The reanimated Robin was perhaps the easiest, if the term easy could even apply. It was small, and its unnatural intelligence seemed to recognize a shift in the power dynamic. Using a piece of stale bread, a ludicrous offering to a creature that no longer needed sustenance, she managed to coax it onto the hearth shovel. Its obsidian eyes watched her, unblinking, as she slowly, carefully carried it upstairs, its dry clicks a rhythmic, mocking commentary on her actions. The attic door creaked open, releasing a gust of cold, musty air. She tipped the shovel, and the robin fluttered awkwardly into the gloom, its stiff wings beating against the dust-laden air before it settled on a cobweb-draped rafter, a tiny, malevolent gargoyle. One down. Pip was more difficult. The reanimated terrier, though slow and unsteady, possessed a low, brute strength and an unnerving, silent resistance. He seemed to understand her intent, his one good brown eye fixing on her with a look that, for a fleeting, horrifying moment, seemed almost accusatory, almost sad. Elara's heart, or what was left of it, twisted. She tried luring him with his old rubber ball, the one Midnight had spent so long communing with, but the reanimated Pip showed no interest. In the end, it was a grim, physical struggle. She had to half-drag, half-cajole the stiff, gurgling creature up the narrow attic stairs, its decaying claws scraping against the wood, the faint, sweetish odor of its corruption filling her nostrils. When she finally managed to maneuver him inside, he slumped onto the dusty floorboards with a soft, wet thud, his clouded eye staring blankly, his good eye continuing its silent, unnerving watch. Two down, the reanimated squirrel, with its mangled body and erratic, twitching movements, was a nightmare of unpredictable motion. It skittered and clawed, its feral, glowing eyes darting around wildly. Elara, her nerves stretched to their breaking point, resorted to trapping it under an old wicker laundry basket, then sliding the basket with its thrashing, scratching occupant up the stairs and into the attic. She quickly overturned the basket, and the squirrel shot out, a blur of grotesque motion, disappearing into the deepest, darkest corner of the attic, its frantic scrabbling echoing in the silence. Three down, she slammed the attic door shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling with exertion and a profound, soul-deep weariness. She fumbled with the old iron bolt, sliding it home with a decisive, grim finality. The sounds from within were chilling. The dry, rhythmic clicking of the robin, the occasional soft, wet gurgle from Pip, and the frantic, muffled skittering of the squirrel. It was a symphony of the damned, playing out just above her head. As she descended the stairs, shaky and nauseous, she found Midnight. He was sitting calmly at the bottom of the attic steps, directly in front of the now-bolted door. He was grooming a paw with meticulous, almost ostentatious care, but his luminous green eyes were fixed on the attic door, a flicker of something ancient and knowing within their depths. As Elara reached the bottom step, he began to purr. That deep, resonant thrum, which had once offered a strange, perverse comfort, now sounded like a dark, triumphant proclamation. A sleek black sentinel presiding over his macabre collection. Elara stared at him, a cold dread seeping in her bones. Was this what he wanted? To gather these things? To what end? The cat offered no answers, only that unwavering, intelligent gaze and the deep, vibrating purr that seemed to mock her fear. That night, sleep was an impossibility. The sound from the attic, though muffled by the floorboards, were a constant, unnerving presence. The clicking, the gurgling, the skittering, they formed a grotesque, ever-present soundtrack to her torment. Sometime in the small, dark hours of the morning, a new sound joined the cacophony. A faint, rhythmic thumping. Thump, pause, thump, pause. It was a soft, almost melancholic sound. At first, she could see nothing but shifting shadows and dust motes. Then, a shape moved into her narrow field of vision. It was Pip. The reanimated terrier was standing before an old. His movements stiff and jerky. Thump. He would push it, and it would rock forward slightly, its cracked rocker making a soft thudding sound as it connected with the floorboards. Pause. Then he would nudge it again. Thump. He was playing, or at least performing a grotesque, silent parody of play. There was no joy in the movement, no spark of life, only a relentless, mechanical repetition. He was a broken toy himself, attempting to interact with another broken toy in the dusty mausoleum of her past. The sight was so profoundly, deeply disturbing, so utterly melancholic and horrifying that Elara pulled back from the keyhole, a strangled sob catching in her throat. The attic was no longer just a prison. It was a nursery of nightmares. A playroom for the damned, and Midnight, the purring black cat, was its silent, watchful curator. Chapter 7. Midnight's Gaze. The attic became a sealed chamber of horrors, its grotesque occupants a constant, oppressive weight on Elara's mind. The rhythmic thumping of the reanimated Pip playing with a broken rocking horse became a particularly insidious torment, a sound that underscored the profound wrongness of it all. Elara avoided the upper floor as much as possible, the very air near the attic door feeling thick with a palpable malevolence. Downstairs, Midnight reigned with a quiet, confident authority. He seemed entirely unperturbed by the confinement of his reanimated gifts, his days spent in their usual routine of napping in Arthur's armchair, staring out windows, or increasingly, watching Elara with an intensity that felt both possessive and unervingly perceptive. His luminous green eyes seemed to miss nothing, to penetrate her carefully constructed facade of numb endurance, to see the fear and despair churning within her. One gray, drizzly afternoon, Elara was in the living room, listlessly dusting Arthur's collection of antique maps. Another futile attempt to impose order on her chaotic existence. The silence in the room was broken only by the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock and the soft sigh of rain against the window panes. She became aware, slowly, of a change in the room's atmosphere, a subtle shift in the quality of the silence. She turned. Midnight was no longer curled in Arthur's armchair. He was sitting bolt upright on the plush velvet seat, his sleek black body perfectly still, his attention utterly transfixed. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring, with an almost unnerving intensity, at the mantelpiece. Specifically, he was staring at a framed photograph of Arthur. It was Elara's favorite picture of him, taken on their 25th wedding anniversary. He was smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners, a look of deep, abiding love on his face. It was the Arthur she remembered, the Arthur she mourned, the Arthur whose absence was a constant, gaping wound in her soul. Midnight's gaze was unwavering, his green eyes fixed on the smiling image of the man Elara had loved more than life itself. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, silent, motionless, save for the almost imperceptible twitch of his whiskers. There was no purr, no sound at all, just this intense, focused scrutiny. Elara felt a cold dread begin to uncoil in the pit of her stomach, a dread far deeper and more personal than anything she had yet experienced. The reanimated Robin, Pip, the squirrel, they were horrors, yes, but they were in a way peripheral. This felt different. This felt targeted. Midnight's prolonged, silent contemplation of Arthur's photograph was freighted with a terrible, unspoken significance. It was as if the cat were studying him, memorizing his features, assessing him. For what purpose? The question hung in the chilled air of the living room, heavy and menacing. A sudden, horrifying realization began to crystallize in Elara's mind, so monstrous, so unthinkable, that she initially recoiled from it. Midnight wasn't just bringing random dead things back to a twisted semblance of life. He wasn't merely a conduit for some indiscriminate, chaotic force. There was a pattern, a horrifying, personal pattern to his resurrections. The Robin, a creature of her garden, a space she shared with Arthur's memory. The roses, Arthur's prized snow queens, transformed into something alien and blood-red. Pip, her beloved childhood companion, a deep and personal loss from her distant past. And now, this intense, unnerving focus on Arthur himself. A cold sweat broke out on Elara's skin. Her breath hitched. She began to suspect, with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow, that Midnight was not merely offering random, grotesque gifts. He was curating his resurrections. He was targeting subjects of deep emotional significance to her. Each reanimation was a twisted echo of something she had loved, something she had mourned. Each resurrected horror was a perversion of a cherished memory, a deliberate, calculated strike at the very core of her being. The implications were staggering, terrifying. If this were true, then the reanimated creatures in her attic were not just random abominations. They were stepping stones, preludes to a far greater, far more personal, and infinitely more horrifying gift. The ultimate gift. Arthur. The thought slammed into her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless, her vision swimming. To see Arthur again, yes, her grieving heart cried out for it. Achingly, desperately. But not like this. Not as a grotesque, clicking, gurgling parody. Not as a hollowed shell animated by that same dark, unholy power that resided in Midnight's ancient eyes. The image of Arthur, her kind, gentle Arthur, transformed into one of those things, was a horror beyond comprehension, a desecration she would not allow. Midnight finally broke his silent vigil, turning his head slowly to look at Elara. His green eyes, usually so inscrutable, now seemed to hold a flicker of something akin to anticipation, or perhaps it was a cold, calculating assessment of her reaction. He let out a soft, almost questioning meow, a sound so uncharacteristically normal that it was, in itself, deeply unsettling. Then, with a fluid, deliberate movement, he leaped from the armchair, padded silently across the room, and rubbed against Elara's legs, his purse starting up that deep, resonant thrum that now felt like the vibrations of an earthquake, heralding an unimaginable devastation. Elara stood frozen, the duster falling from her numb fingers, her mind reeling from the weight of her terrible, dawning realization. Midnight's gaze had shown her the abyss, and it was staring back, wearing the face of her dearest love. Chapter 8. The Blackwood Grimoire. The horrifying realization that Midnight was systematically targeting her deepest emotional connections with the ultimate, unthinkable gift of a reanimated Arthur looming as a terrifying possibility, galvanized Elara Weatherly out of her passive despair. Fear, sharper and more potent than any grief, became her unwilling propellant. She could no longer simply endure. She had to understand. She had to find answers, to uncover the nature of the insidious power that had invaded her life, that purred contentedly at her feet while orchestrating a symphony of nightmares in her attic. Blackwood Creek, she knew, was an old town, one of the first settlements in the county. Its history was long, and like many old towns, it undoubtedly harbored secrets, forgotten lore buried beneath layers of mundane modernity. Her thoughts turned to the Blackwood Creek Historical Society, a dusty, neglected institution housed in the equally ancient and reputedly haunted Thaddeus Blackwood building on the town square. It was a place few visited, its archives largely ignored, a repository of forgotten lives and faded stories. Perhaps, just perhaps, within its crumbling walls lay a clue, a forgotten tale, a whisper of understanding that could arm her against the encroaching darkness. Driven by a desperate, almost frantic urgency, Elara left the oppressive silence of her home, leaving midnight watching her with those unervingly intelligent green eyes. The short walk to the town square felt like a journey through alien territory. The familiar faces of Blackwood Creek, the mundane chatter of everyday life, seemed surreal, a thin veneer over the roiling horror that consumed her. The Thaddeus Blackwood building loomed before her, its grimy stone facade and narrow, dark-paned windows exuding an air of melancholic decay. The Historical Society occupied the ground floor, its entrance marked by a faded, hand-painted sign. Inside, the air was cool and still, smelling faintly of dust, mildew, and old paper. Mrs. Gable, the Society's ancient, bird-like curator, looked up from her meticulously organized index cards, her spectacles perched precariously on the end of her nose. She greeted Elara with surprised, watery eyes. "Elara Weatherly, what a pleasant surprise. We don't get many visitors these days." Elara forced a polite, if strained, smile. "I was hoping to do a little research, Mrs. Gable, on some of the older local folklore. Anything pertaining to unusual occurrences or animals." The last word felt heavy, freighted with unspoken terror. Mrs. Gable blinked. "Folklore? Animals? Well, we have plenty of records, my dear. Diaries, town ledgers, old family histories. Though I can't say much of it is organized by unusual occurrences." She gestured vaguely towards a series of towering, overflowing shelves. "Help yourself. Just try not to disturb the dust too much. It's practically historic itself." For hours, Elara waded through a sea of brittle, yellowed paper. She pored over faded script and pioneer diaries, deciphered the spidery handwriting in ancient town meeting minutes, scanned through brittle, foxed newspapers detailing crop failures, barn fires, and long-forgotten scandals. Most of it was mundane, a dry recitation of lives lived and lost. But Elara persisted, her fear a relentless taskmaster. She searched for any mention of strange animals, unexplained deaths, or resurrections. Her fingers stained with dust, her eyes aching from the strain. Just as despair began to set in, as the afternoon light began to fade outside the grimy windows, she stumbled upon it. Tucked away in a forgotten wooden crate in a dark corner of the archives, beneath a pile of moth-eaten christening gowns and tarnished silver trophies, was a small, unassuming volume. It was bound in cracked, blackened leather, its pages brittle and water-stained, secured by a simple leather thong. There was no title on its spine, no author's name. It felt different from the other records. Older, darker. With trembling hands, Elara untied the thong and opened the book. The pages were filled with a spidery, cramped script, written in faded brown ink that looked almost like dried blood. The language was archaic, filled with strange symbols and unsettling, half-familiar words. It was not a diary in the conventional sense, nor a town record. It felt more like a personal journal, a grimoire, almost a chronicle of something else. As Elara deciphered the difficult script, a chill began to creep up her spine, colder and more profound than the damp air of the archives. The journal spoke of the veil between worlds, of entities that walk in shadow, and of conduits of ancient power. And then, her blood ran cold. A chapter, if it could be called that, detailed a creature referred to as the Soul Stealer's Cat, or, more chillingly, the Harbinger of Sorrows. The description was terrifyingly familiar, a feline of midnight fur, with eyes like chips of emerald, possessing an uncanny intelligence and the power to manipulate the fragile boundary between life and death. It spoke of the cat's ability to draw back shades from the underworld, to reanimate the dead, not as they were, but as hollowed ones, empty shells filled with dark echoes and an insatiable, indefinable hunger. The grimoire described these reanimated beings with horrifying accuracy. Their unnatural movements, their vacant eyes, their detachment from their former selves. It detailed their slow decay, their grotesque transformations, and their unwavering, often malevolent, focus on those they had known in life. A particular passage leaped out at Elara, seizing her with an icy grip. The Harbinger does not choose its subjects idly. It seeks out the deepest grief, the most profound attachments, for it is through these tethers of sorrow that it weaves its darkest enchantments. Each shade returned is a stepping stone, a carefully chosen offering to bind the grieving soul ever tighter to its unholy master. The hollowed ones are never the same. They carry the taint of the grave, the coldness of the void. Their touch is corruption, their presence a blight, and they inevitably, inexorably, bring ruin and despair to those they once loved. For their purpose is not comfort, but the slow, agonizing consumption of the spirit. Elara's hands trembled so violently she could barely hold the ancient book. This was it. This was midnight. This was the explanation for the robin, for Pip, for the squirrel, for the blood-red roses. This was the horrifying truth behind the cat's gifts. The grimoire didn't offer solutions. No easy incantations or wards against such a creature. It was a chronicle of despair, a testament to an ancient, implacable evil, but gave her knowledge. And knowledge, however terrifying, was a weapon. As she carefully retied the leather thong around the grimoire, her mind raced. The hollowed ones, ruin and despair, the consumption of the spirit, and the cat, the harbinger of sorrows, feeding on her grief, leading her, step by horrifying step, towards an unimaginable abyss. She knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones like a winter frost, that she had to fight, not just for her sanity, but for her very soul. And, most importantly, for Arthur's peace, a peace midnight seemed determined to shatter. She slipped the Blackwood grimoire into her handbag, a silent vow forming in her heart. The time for passive endurance was over. The time for battle had begun. Chapter 9, The Doll with Empty Eyes. The discovery of the Blackwood grimoire, with its chillingly accurate descriptions of the harbinger of sorrows and the hollowed ones, shifted something fundamental within Elara. The nebulous, creeping dread that had consumed her began to coalesce into a more defined, if no less terrifying, enemy. Knowledge, however grim, had armed her with a sliver of agency. She now understood, at least in part, the nature of Midnight's power and his insidious, grief-fueled agenda. The reanimated creatures in her attic were not just random horrors. They were calculated steps in a macabre dance, leading towards the ultimate desecration, the return of Arthur as one of the Hollowed. This she would not allow. Her passive victimhood was shed, replaced by a cold, grim determination. She had to protect Arthur's memory, his peace, even if it meant confronting an evil that seemed ancient and implacable. Her days took on a new, albeit still terrifying, rhythm. The archaic language and cryptic passages offered few easy answers, but a grim understanding began to form. The Harbinger's power seemed intrinsically linked to grief, to emotional anchors. Perhaps, she reasoned, if she could somehow lessen her own visible sorrow, project an air of detachment, it might weaken his hold, or at least confuse his dark intent. It was a desperate, fragile hope, but it was something. She began to force herself through the motions of a more normal life, though her heart felt like a stone in her chest. She tended to the front garden, the part visible from the street, with a performative diligence, avoiding the blood-red roses that pulsed with unnatural life in the back. She even exchanged strained pleasantries with Mrs. Gable when she encountered her at the local grocer, the grimoire a heavy, secret weight in her handbag. Meanwhile, the sounds from the attic continued, a constant, unnerving reminder of the horrors contained within. The clicking, the gurgling, the thumping of Pip's grotesque play with the rocking horse. And Midnight, ever watchful, seemed to sense the shift in her, his luminous green eyes following her with an even more intense, calculating scrutiny. His purr, once a constant thrum, now seemed more intermittent, more questioning, as if he were puzzled by her newfound, albeit fragile, composure. Elara knew it was a dangerous game. She was walking a razor's edge, trying to outwit a creature of ancient, malevolent intelligence. One crisp November afternoon, a few days after her discovery of the grimoire, a new element intruded upon Elara's carefully maintained, fear-filled world. Her next-door neighbors, the young and cheerful Millers, had their 5-year-old niece, Lily, visiting for the day. Elara heard the child's bright laughter drifting over the fence as she played in the Miller's backyard, a sound so innocent and full of life it felt like a painful stab to Elara's heart. But have you by any chance seen a doll? Lily was playing near the fence line, and her favorite doll, Miss Annabelle, has gone missing. It's an antique porcelain doll, quite distinctive. Lily's heartbroken. Elara's blood ran cold. A doll, an object of affection, near her property line. The familiar pattern of Midnight's insidious elections sent a jolt of fresh terror through her. She managed a sympathetic, if somewhat strained, denial. "Oh dear, no, I haven't seen it, Sarah, but I'll certainly keep an eye out." Mrs. Miller thanked her and left, her worry palpable. Elara immediately scanned her own yard, her gaze darting into the overgrown shrubs and beneath the blighted rose bushes. Nothing. Perhaps, she prayed, it was just a lost toy, a normal childhood mishap, unrelated to the horrors that plagued her. That evening, as twilight bled into a starless, oppressive night, Elara was sitting in her living room, the Blackwood grimoire open on her lap, its cryptic words swimming before her tired eyes. A faint creak from the back porch, barely audible above the sigh of the wind, made her freeze. She listened, her senses on high alert. Nothing. She told herself it was just the old house settling. Then another creak closer this time, followed by the soft thud of something landing on the wooden swing seat Arthur had built years ago. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Midnight, who had been dozing by the cold hearth, lifted his head, his ears pricked, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He rose, stretched, and padded silently towards the back door, his body low to the ground, a sleek black predator. Elara followed, her dread a cold, heavy presence. She peered through the kitchen window. There, sitting primly upright on the porch swing, as if carefully placed, was Miss Annabelle, the antique porcelain doll, its painted blue eyes wide and staring, its rosy cheeks gleaming faintly in the gloom. Its lace-trimmed dress was slightly askew, a smudge of dirt on its porcelain forehead. It looked utterly, chillingly out of place, a silent, inanimate sentinel in the encroaching darkness. And beside it, grooming a paw with an air of nonchalant satisfaction, was Midnight. He glanced up at Elara, then at the doll, a flicker of that same possessive, proprietary light in his green eyes that she had seen when he presented his other gifts. Elara's breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. A doll? It wasn't alive. It couldn't be reanimated. Could it? The grimoire had spoken of hollowed ones, of shades drawn back from the underworld. It hadn't mentioned inanimate objects. But then, the roses weren't alive in the conventional sense either, yet they pulsed with an unnatural, corrupted life. Fear, sharp and sickening, warred with a desperate hope that this was just Midnight's perverse sense of humor, a macabre offering of a different kind. She had to retrieve it, to return it to Lily before what? She didn't dare complete the thought. Taking a shaky breath, she unlocked the back door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Miss Annabelle sat perfectly still, her painted smile fixed, her wide blue eyes seeming to follow Elara's every move. Midnight watched, his tail twitching almost imperceptibly. As Elara reached out a trembling hand towards the doll, its head moved. Not a sudden, jerky movement, but a slow, deliberate, audible creak like old wood under strain. Its porcelain neck twisted, and its painted face turned to look directly at her. A faint, dry whisper, like the rustling of ancient silk or the sigh of dust motes in a sunbeam, seemed to emanate from its perfectly formed, unmoving porcelain lips. The sound was barely there, almost subliminal, yet it sent a shockwave of pure, undiluted horror through Elara. She snatched the doll. It's cold. Elara carried Miss Annabelle, the doll with the empty, whispering eyes, up the narrow stairs to the attic to join the other horrors in their dusty prison. The menagerie was growing, and Elara knew, with a chilling certainty, that each new addition brought her one step closer to midnight's ultimate, terrifying gift. Chapter 10. The Corruption Within. The addition of Miss Annabelle to the attic menagerie marked a subtle but significant shift in the grim ecosystem of Elara's hidden horrors. The doll, with its painted, watchful eyes and the faint, dry whispers that seemed to sigh from its porcelain lips, became an unnerving focal point. Elara, forced to periodically bring meager offerings of water, a futile gesture, she knew, but one she couldn't entirely abandon, to the reanimated Pip and the twitching squirrel, would see the doll propped against a stack of old hat boxes, its gaze seemingly fixed on the attic door, as if awaiting some unspoken command. The other creatures, the clicking robin, the gurgling Pip, the skittering squirrel, often seemed to arrange themselves around it, their grotesque forms arrayed in a silent, unsettling tableau. It was as if the doll, inanimate yet imbued with that same dark, whispering sentience, possessed a strange, silent authority over its living or unliving counterparts. Weeks bled into a bleak, early winter. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, colder, and filled with a deeper, more oppressive dread. Elara's attempts to project detachment, to starve midnight of her grief, felt increasingly futile. The constant proximity to the horrors in her attic, the weight of the Blackwood grimoire's terrible secrets, and the ever-present, watchful gaze of the harbinger of sorrows were eroding her resolve, grinding down her spirit. The house itself seemed to be succumbing to the corruption. The sweetish odor of decay, once confined to the vicinity of the reanimated creatures, now seemed to permeate every room, a cloying, inescapable miasma. Strange, faint molds, like dark lace, began to appear in shadowy corners, despite Elara's frantic scrubbing. The vibrant, blood-red roses in the back garden, even under a dusting of early snow, bloomed with an obscene, defiant vigor, their thorns like enameled claws. Then, the transformations began. The first to succumb further to the unnatural forces that animated it was the reanimated robin. One morning, Elara, steeling herself for her reluctant ascent to the attic, heard a change in the usual chorus of horrors. The dry, rhythmic clicking was absent. In its place was a series underscore of soft, wet, tearing sounds. Her stomach churned with a sick premonition. When she cautiously opened the attic door, the source of the sound was immediately apparent and horrifying. The reanimated robin, which had usually perched on a rafter, lay on the dusty floorboards, but was no longer a bird, not really. It had collapsed, not into dust, as one might expect of a decaying creature, but into a pulsating, glistening pile of matted feathers, tiny, brittle bones, and a dark, viscous, tar-like ichor. The ichor seemed to be alive, twitching and writhing with a slow, sickening rhythm, and it was visibly, audibly, absorbing the wooden floorboards beneath it. The change in the robin heralded a new, even more grotesque phase for the other reanimated creatures. Pip, her once beloved terrier, began to exhibit an advanced, unnatural decay that went far beyond simple decomposition. His matted fur sloughed off in large, wet patches, revealing glistening, dark, almost translucent flesh beneath. Strange, phosphorescent fungi, in shades of sickly green and lurid purple, began to sprout from his decaying form, glowing faintly in the attic's gloom. His one good eye, those still fixed on Elara whenever she entered, seemed to be receding further into its socket, surrounded by a dark, spreading stain. The gurgling sounds he made became deeper, wetter, interspersed with soft, sorrowful moans that were almost terrifyingly human. The reanimated squirrel underwent an equally horrifying metamorphosis. Its limbs, already twisted and mangled, began to elongate, to stretch and warp at unnatural angles, its small body becoming a grotesque parody of a quadruped. Its fur fell away to reveal a taut, grayish skin and its teeth, visible in its permanently snarling snout, grew longer, sharper like tiny, needle-like daggers. It moved with a disturbing, spider-like agility, its glowing feral eyes darting around the attic with a heightened, predatory malevolence. The sounds from the attic evolved as well. The familiar clicks, gurgles, and skitterings were now overlaid with newer, more disturbing noises. There were soft, sorrowful moans that seemed to echo Elara's own despair, disjointed whispers that sounded like fragments of forgotten conversations, and sometimes, most chillingly, a sound that resembled distorted, mocking laughter, dry and rasping, like leaves skittering across a tombstone. The attic was no longer just a prison for reanimated pets. It was a breeding ground for nameless, evolving horrors, a festering wound in the heart of Elara's home. And at the center of it all, seemingly untouched by the decay and transformation consuming the others, sat Miss Annabelle. The porcelain doll, with its painted smile and empty, whispering eyes, remained pristine, its lace dress unsoiled, its china skin smooth and cool. It seemed to be a focal point, a conductor for the dark energies that pulsed within the sealed room. The other attic denizens, in their increasingly grotesque forms, the ichorous remains of the robin, the fungoid pip thing, the elongated squirrel abomination, often arranged themselves around it, as if awaiting silent instruction, their transformed bodies a hideous court paying homage to a silent porcelain queen. Elara's visits to the attic became exercises in pure terror. She would force herself to open the door, to place the now untouched offerings of water, her gaze averted from the pulsating ichor, the fungal growths, the elongated limbs. The stench was overpowering, a noxious blend of decay, mildew, and something else, something acrid and unidentifiable. She would flee as quickly as possible. The sounds of the moans, the whispers, the mocking laughter following her down the stairs, seeping into the very fabric of her sanity. Midnight, during these times, would often be found waiting at the bottom of the attic stairs, his green eyes gleaming with that same unsettling, proprietary satisfaction. He seemed pleased with the progress of his collection. He would rub against her legs, purring deeply, as if offering a perverse form of encouragement, or perhaps a silent, chilling reminder of his ultimate, horrifying goal. The corruption was not just within the attic. It was within Elara herself, seeping into her soul, dragging her down into a despair so profound it felt like a living death. The harbinger of sorrows was patiently, inexorably weaving its web, and Elara, caught in its silken, terrifying strands, could feel the last vestiges of her hope, her strength, her very self, beginning to unravel. The Blackwood grimoire offered no solace, only confirmation of the escalating horror. It spoke of the hallowed, eventually losing all semblance of their former selves. The fate awaiting Arthur. Chapter 11. No escape from midnight. The escalating horrors in the attic, coupled with the chilling pronouncements of the Blackwood grimoire, pushed Elara to a desperate breaking point. The passive endurance, the fragile attempts at detachment, had failed. The corruption was deepening, the malevolence growing, and midnight, the purring architect of her torment, remained a constant. Watchful presence, his green eyes gleaming with an ancient, knowing power. She realized, with a stark and terrifying clarity, that she could not simply wait for the inevitable. She had to act, to try and sever the connection, to rid herself of the harbinger of sorrows before he could unleash his ultimate, most devastating gift. The thought of confronting Midnight directly, of trying to harm him, was daunting. He was no ordinary cat. The grimoire had made that abundantly clear. But the thought of Arthur, her beloved Arthur, transformed into one of those things, was a horror that dwarfed all other fears. Her first, desperate plan was one of banishment. If she could somehow remove Midnight from her home, from Blackwood Creek, perhaps his influence would wane. Perhaps the reanimated creatures in the attic would fade. It was a naive hope, born of desperation, but it was all she had. She found an old, sturdy cat carrier in the dusty recesses of the garage, its wire mesh door slightly rusted. Luring Midnight into it proved surprisingly, unsettlingly easy. She opened a can of his favorite, expensive tuna, the scent usually enough to bring him running. He padded into the kitchen, his tail held high, his purr a low rumble. He eyed the carrier with a flicker of something that might have been suspicion in his green eyes. But the lure of the tuna was too strong. As he stepped inside to investigate the offering, Elara quickly slammed the wire mesh door shut and latched it. Midnight let out a single low, guttural hiss, his eyes blazing with a sudden, cold fury, but he made no attempt to struggle, merely settling down into a watchful, unnerving stillness. The silence from him was more terrifying than any struggle would have been. With the carrier containing its silent, malevolent occupant on the passenger seat beside her, Elara drove. She drove for hours, far out of Blackwood Creek, through unfamiliar countryside, the landscape blurring into a monotonous green and brown. She had no clear destination in mind, only the desperate need to put as much distance as possible between herself and the harbinger of sorrows. Finally, in a small, anonymous town several counties away, she spotted a sign for an animal shelter. Her heart, a cold knot of dread and guilt, pounded in her chest. This felt like a betrayal, even of a creature so monstrous. But what choice did she have? She pulled into the deserted parking lot of the shelter, a low, nondescript building. She needed a moment to compose herself, to gather the courage to walk in and hand over this entity. She stopped the car, turned off the engine, and took a deep, shaky breath. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not knowing if she was talking to Midnight, to herself, or to the universe. She unbuckled her seatbelt and reached for the carrier handle. It was empty. Elara stared, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. The carrier door was still securely latched. There were no holes, no tears in the wire mesh. But Midnight was gone, vanished, as if he had simply dissolved into the very air. A cold, prickling fear, far deeper than any she had yet known, washed over her. This was not natural. This was not possible. She fumbled with the latch, threw open the carrier door, her hands patting frantically inside the empty space. Nothing. He was gone. Defeated, shaken to her core, a profound sense of futility settling over her like a shroud. Elara turned the car around and began the long, silent drive back to Blackwood Creek. The hope that had flickered so briefly had been brutally extinguished. There was no banishing Midnight. He was not bound by physical constraints, by locked doors or wire mesh. He was something else. Midnight was sitting serenely on her front porch, meticulously cleaning a paw, his sleek black fur unruffled. He looked up as she approached, his green eyes gleaming in the fading light, as if he had never left, as if her desperate, multi-county journey had been nothing more than a minor, amusing diversion for him. He let out a soft, almost welcoming meow, then turned and, with a flick of his tail, disappeared into the house through the cat flap Arthur had installed years ago for a previous, long-forgotten pet. A cat flap Elara had, until that moment, completely forgotten existed. Her second attempt was born of an even deeper desperation, a darker resolve. The grimoire, while offering no easy solutions, had hinted at the vulnerability of such entities to certain substances, things that disrupted the natural order, that clouded the senses. Sleeping pills. She still had a bottle of Arthur's old prescription, strong sedatives he had rarely used. The thought of poisoning Midnight, of ending his reign of terror in such a final, definitive way, filled her with a mixture of revulsion and a grim, almost savage determination. That night, her hands trembling, she crushed several of the potent pills into a fine powder and mixed it thoroughly into a saucer of fresh, creamy milk, Midnight's favorite treat. She placed the saucer on the kitchen floor, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Midnight," she called, her voice a hoarse whisper. He padded into the kitchen, his purr a low, expectant rumble. He approached the saucer, sniffed at the milk, then he stopped. He lifted his head and looked directly at Elara. His luminous green eyes, usually so inscrutable, now blazed with an undeniable, chilling intelligence. A look of pure, unadulterated knowing. A low, guttural growl, deeper and more menacing than any sound she had ever heard him make, rumbled in his chest. It was not the growl of an animal. It was the sound of an ancient, offended power. His eyes flashed, an eerie, almost predatory green. He did not touch the milk. He simply stared at her, that terrible, knowing growl vibrating in the silence of the kitchen, a clear, unambiguous message. He knew. He understood her intent, and he would not be so easily dispatched. Elara backed away, her carefully constructed plan crumbling into dust, her last vestiges of hope turning to a cold, numbing despair. There was no escape for Midnight. He was her shadow, her tormentor, her dark confessor, and he was, it seemed, utterly, terrifyingly invincible. The game was his, and he was playing it with a patience and a cruelty that were beyond human comprehension. Chapter 12, The Hallowed Ground. The failure of her attempts to banish or neutralize Midnight plunged Elara into a deeper abyss of despair. The Harbinger of Sorrows was not merely a cat. It was an entity of profound, ancient power, its intelligence far exceeding anything she could have imagined, its resilience seemingly absolute. Her home was its domain, her grief its sustenance, her reanimated loved ones its grotesque trophies. The Blackwood Grimoire, her only source of grim enlightenment, offered no further strategies, only chilling affirmations of the creature's insidious nature and the inevitable ruin it brought. The attic above continued its symphony of horrors, the pulsating ichor of the former Robin, the fungoid, moaning pip thing, the elongated, skittering squirrel abomination, and the silent, whispering porcelain doll, Miss Annabelle, presiding over her court of decay. Elara felt herself becoming a ghost in her own life, her will slowly eroding under the constant, oppressive weight of supernatural dread. Then, for the first time since his arrival, Midnight disappeared, not in the inexplicable, vanishing way he had from the cat carrier, but a genuine, prolonged absence. One morning, Elara awoke to a silence in the house that was different, deeper. Midnight was not at the foot of her bed. He was not in Arthur's armchair. He did not appear for his morning saucer of milk, the untainted kind she now offered with a sense of hollow ritual. A full day passed, then a night, and still no sign of him. A strange, conflicted mixture of emotions warred within Elara. A part of her, the part that still clung to a desperate, irrational hope, dared to imagine he was gone for good, that perhaps his dark purpose had been fulfilled or thwarted, or that he had simply moved on. But another, deeper, more instinctual part of her knew this was not an ending, but a prelude. An absence like this, from a creature of such deliberate, focused intent, could only mean something significant. Neglected graveyard on the outskirts of town, where generations of Blackwood Creek residents lay beneath weathered, moss-covered stones. Where Arthur lay, the wrought iron gates of St. Augustine's creaked open with a mournful groan as Elara pushed them. The air within the cemetery walls was cold, still, and heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else. Something ancient and sorrowful. Many of the headstones were tilted, some fallen, their inscriptions eroded by time and neglect. It was a place of quiet decay, a forgotten corner of Blackwood Creek where the dead slept, or were supposed to sleep, undisturbed. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence. She knew, with a chilling certainty, what she would find. She made her way along the winding, overgrown paths, her gaze scanning the rows of weathered stones, until she reached the familiar, simple granite marker that bore Arthur Weatherly's name. And there, curled asleep directly upon the slightly raised mound of earth that covered her husband's grave, was Midnight. He lay in a perfect, sleek black circle, his body rising and falling with the slow, even rhythm of sleep, an image of profound, almost sacrilegious peace. His fur, the color of polished jet, was a stark contrast against the faded green of the grass and the gray granite of the headstone. He looked, for all the world, like an ordinary cat napping in a quiet, sunny spot. Except there was no sun, only the oppressive gray sky. And this was no ordinary cat, and this was no ordinary napping spot. This was hallowed ground, or at least ground that should have been hallowed, consecrated to the memory of the dead, to the peace of the departed. Midnight's presence here, sleeping so soundly upon Arthur's final resting place, felt like the ultimate desecration, a brazen, arrogant claim. Elara stared, a silent scream trapped in her throat. The premonition had been horribly, terrifyingly accurate. This was it. This was what Midnight's absence had been about. He had been here, communing with the earth, with the remains of her husband, preparing for his final, most personal, most devastating gift. As if sensing her presence, Midnight's eyes snapped open. Those luminous green orbs, ancient and knowing, fixed on Elara. He did not hiss, did not growl, did not even purr. He simply looked at her, a long, unwavering gaze that seemed to penetrate her very soul. A gaze that held a chilling mixture of triumph, anticipation, and a profound, almost pitying, understanding of the horror he was about to unleash. He stretched languidly, his claws extending and retracting, then rose, his black form a stark silhouette against the weathered granite. He took a few steps, then paused, looking down at the grave, then back at Elara, as if to ensure she understood the significance of this place, of this moment. The horrifying realization, which had been a growing suspicion, now crystallized into an undeniable, soul-shattering certainty. Midnight's ultimate gift was intended to be Arthur himself, clawed back from the sanctity of the grave, twisted into one of the hallowed ones. And then Elara noticed it, something she had overlooked in her initial shock. The soil around the base of the headstone, the very earth that covered Arthur's coffin, was subtly disturbed. Not dug up, not yet, but unsettled, as if something had been testing it from below, probing its resistance, preparing for an imminent emergence. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor seemed to run through the ground beneath her feet. Midnight let out a soft, almost inaudible meow, a sound that was less a call and more a summons. The air grew colder, the silence more profound, more charged. The harbinger of sorrows had chosen his stage, and the final, terrible act was about to begin. Chapter 13, The Night of Unearthing. The sight of the disturbed earth around Arthur's headstone, the chillingly possessive way Midnight regarded the grave, shattered the last vestiges of Elara's horrified paralysis. The grimoire's warnings, the escalating horrors in her attic, her own terrifying premonitions, it all converged into this single, horrifying point. Midnight was not just planning to reanimate Arthur. He was here, at the grave, actively instigating the process. There was no more time for fear, for hesitation. Only a desperate, primal need to protect Arthur's peace, to prevent this ultimate desecration, fueled her. She turned and fled St. Augustine's, her mind a maelstrom of terror and grim resolve. She didn't know what she could do, how she could possibly fight an entity of such power, but she knew she had to try. She had to return. She had to stop him, back at her house, which now felt like a besieged fortress. Elara moved with a frantic, almost feral energy. Her first thought was fire. The grimoire had made vague, cryptic references to purifying flame as a potential, if extreme, deterrent to entities that clung to the shadows. It was a desperate long shot, but it was something. From the shed, she retrieved a heavy iron spade, its metal edge still caked with the garden soil from her earlier feudal burials. She also found an old, half-full can of kerosene, kept for the emergency heater they rarely used. The acrid smell of it filled her nostrils, a scent of finality, of destruction. Armed with these crude weapons, her heart a cold, hammering knot of dread and a strange, almost righteous fury, Elara prepared to return to St. Augustine's. She spared a fleeting thought for the horrors in her attic, the pulsating ichor, the fungoid pip thing, the elongated squirrel, the whispering doll. Were they a part of this? Would they be summoned? The grimoire had spoken of the hallowed ones being drawn to their master. Elara made her way back to the cemetery. The air was heavy, still, and unnaturally cold. The usual evening chorus of crickets and cicadas was absent. A profound, expectant silence hung over Blackwood Creek, as if the very town were holding its breath. The wrought iron gates of St. Augustine's loomed before her, dark and skeletal against the fading light. He turned his luminous green eyes towards Elara as she approached, a low, almost inaudible growl rumbling in his chest. It was not a sound of aggression, but of warning, of possessive claim. The air around the grave felt even colder now, almost frigid, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to emanate from the ground itself, a vile, unseen energy thrumming beneath her feet. The disturbed earth around the headstones seemed more pronounced, the soil looser, as if something were actively pushing up from below. Then, from the shadowy depths of the cemetery, from behind weathered tombstones and beneath ancient, gnarled trees, they came. The horrors from her attic. The pulsating, ichorous mass that had once been a robin oozed and slithered across the damp grass, leaving a glistening trail of black slime in its wake, its embedded obsidian eyes gleaming with malevolent light. The pip thing, its fungoid growths glowing with an eerie phosphorescence, shambled forward with its stiff, jerky gait, its one good eye fixed on Elara, a low, sorrowful moan escaping its decaying muzzle. The elongated squirrel abomination, its movements a horrifying blend of spider and mammal, skittered out from behind a mausoleum, its needle-like teeth bared in a silent snarl, its glowing feral eyes darting around with predatory speed. And last, carried or perhaps propelled by some unseen force, came Miss Annabelle. The porcelain doll, its painted smile fixed and serene, its empty eyes seeming to survey the scene with a cold, calculating intelligence, floated just above the ground, its lace dress undisturbed by its unnatural locomotion. They converged on Arthur's grave, drawn by midnight's silent summons, forming a grotesque, terrifying honor guard around their master and his chosen vessel. The sight of them, her reanimated pets, and the whispering doll, assembled here in this sacred place, under the command of the Harbinger of Sorrows, was a vision from the deepest circle of hell. Elara stood frozen for a moment, the spade and kerosene can heavy in her trembling hands, the sheer, unadulterated horror of the scene threatening to overwhelm her. This was it, the unearthing, the culmination of Midnight's insidious campaign. She had to act. Now. No, she screamed, her voice raw, tearing through the oppressive silence. You will not have him. Midnight merely blinked slowly, his green eyes burning into hers. He let out a soft, almost gentle meow, a sound that was chillingly at odds with the abomination he was orchestrating. And then it happened, with a sudden, violent eruption of soil and splintered wood. A hand clawed its way out of the earth of Arthur's grave. It was a desiccated, soil-caked hand, its skin like ancient parchment stretched taut over bone, its fingernails long yellowed and dirt-encrusted. It clawed at the air for a moment, then gripped the edge of the broken coffin lid, pulling. More earth gave way. A second hand emerged, equally grotesque. The reanimated horrors from the attic seemed to lean in, their unnatural forms quivering with a silent, unholy anticipation. The hum from the ground intensified, the air growing colder still, thick with the stench of opened earth and ancient decay. The night of unearthing had truly begun. Chapter 14. He is not himself. The thing that had once been Arthur Weatherly clawed its way from the violated earth with a strength that belied its desiccated state. It rose slowly, stiffly, from the splintered remains of its coffin, a grotesque silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Elara watched in mute, soul-shattering horror. This was not Arthur. This was an abomination, a hideous mockery of the man she had loved. It was unnaturally tall, gaunt, its burial suit, once pristine, now tattered, stained with grave mold and clinging earth. Its skin, where visible, was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones and a prominent jawline. Its hair, once a warm chestnut brown, was now sparse, matted, and streaked with gray grave dust. But it was its eyes, or rather, the lack of them, that seized Elara with the deepest, most primal terror. The sockets were hollow, empty pits, yet from their depths emanated a faint, cold, unholy light, like dying embers in a forgotten fire. This was not the warm, loving gaze of her Arthur. This was the vacant, chilling stare of the hollowed. The reanimated Arthur stood swaying slightly, its head slowly turning, as if taking in its surroundings, its movements jerky, puppet-like. It seemed to recognize the assembled horrors, the Icarus robin thing, the fungoid pip, the elongated squirrel, the whispering doll, with a silent, almost comradely acknowledgement. Then, its hollow gaze found Elara. It paused. A sound, like dry leaves skittering across stone, rasped from its desiccated throat. It took a step towards her, then another, its gait unsteady but imbued with a terrifying, predatory malevolence. Elara, it whispered, and the sound was a horrifying parody of Arthur's voice, dry, thin, devoid of warmth. Like the rustle of ancient, brittle paper. The single word, her name, uttered by this grotesque revenant, was a violation, a desecration of every cherished memory. It recognized her, yes, but not with love, not with the gentle affection she remembered. Its gaze, those glowing, empty pits, held an ancient, unholy hunger, a cold, possessive need that had nothing to do with the man it had once been. This was not reunion. This was an eternity of cold, empty, terrifying companionship being offered, or rather, demanded. Elara stumbled back, the spade and kerosene can feeling like useless trinkets against such an overwhelming, soul-crushing horror. Arthur, no, she choked out, tears streaming down her face. Tears of grief, of terror, of a despair so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. You are not him. Leave him be. The reanimated Arthur tilted its head, a ghastly imitation of a familiar, quizzical gesture her husband used to make. But I am Arthur, it rasped, a hint of something that might have been confusion or perhaps a cruel, mocking patience in its voice. I have come back. Elara, for you. We can be together. Forever. The word forever, spoken by this abomination, was a sentence to an unimaginable hell. Midnight, still perched on the headstone, let out a soft, satisfied purr, the sound a chilling counterpoint to the horror unfolding before them. The reanimated Arthur took another step, its long, desiccated fingers reaching out towards her. Then, with a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture from the revenant, the other horrors sprang into action. The Icarus robin thing slithered forward with surprising speed, its obsidian eyes gleaming, leaving a trail of black slime. The fungoid pip thing, letting out a low, gurgling moan, shambled towards her, its glowing patches of fungus casting an eerie, sickly light. The elongated squirrel abomination, its needle-like teeth bared, darted and weaved with unnatural agility, attempting to flank her. And Miss Annabelle, the porcelain doll, floated silently, its painted eyes fixed on Elara, a faint, dry whisper seeming to urge the others on. A chaotic, desperate battle, if it could even be called that, erupted in the desecrated grounds of St. Augustine's cemetery. Elara, armed only with her grief, her terror, and the heavy iron spade, found herself fighting for her life, for her sanity, for the very soul of the man she loved, against a legion of the reanimated dead, led by the horrifying revenant of her own husband. She swung the spade wildly, connecting with a sickening thud against the fungoid pip thing, sending it sprawling, its sorrowful moan turning into a wet, gurgling shriek. The elongated squirrel darted in, its claws tearing at her coat, its feral eyes burning with a mindless fury. She kicked out, sending it tumbling, only to have the Icarus robin thing begin to ooze up her leg, its cold, slimy touch a violation beyond words. Through it all, the reanimated Arthur advanced. Slowly, inexorably, its hollow eyes fixed on her, its desiccated arms outstretched. "Join us, Elara," it whispered, its voice a siren song of despair. "It is your destiny. It is what you wish for." "No," Elara screamed, tears blinding her. "This isn't what I wished for. I wished for peace. For him to be at peace." She dodged a lunge from the pip thing, its fungal growths leaving a burning sensation on her skin where they brushed against her. The reanimated squirrel was back, leaping onto her shoulder, its needle teeth snapping inches from her face. With a desperate cry, she flung it off, her arms screaming in protest from the effort. She was surrounded, outmatched, a lone figure of defiance against the tide of nightmare. The reanimated Arthur was almost upon her now, its cold, grave-stench breath washing over her, its empty, glowing sockets promising an eternity of horror. The spade felt impossibly heavy, her movements sluggish, her will to fight draining away in the face of such overwhelming, soul-crushing despair. This was the ruin the grimoire had promised. This was the consumption of the spirit. And midnight, the harbinger of sorrows, watched it all, his green eyes gleaming with a cold, ancient, and utterly implacable satisfaction. Chapter 15. The Last Ember of Blackwood Creek. Cornered, exhausted, her arm bleeding from the squirrel abomination's claws, the cold, grave stench of the reanimated Arthur enveloping her. Elara knew she was moments from being overwhelmed. The spade felt like lead in her hands. Despair, thick and cloying, threatened to drown her. But then, through the fog of terror, a single, defiant spark ignited within her. The memory of Arthur, the real Arthur, his warm smile, his gentle eyes, the love they had shared. That pure, untainted memory rose up against the abomination before her. This thing was not him. It was a desecration, a perversion, and she could not allow it to claim his name, his form, his memory. It was an act of love, a final, terrible act of love and profound despair that fueled her next move. With a strangled cry, a sound torn from the very depths of her soul, Elara fumbled for the can of kerosene. Her hands, slick with sweat and a smear of the robin thing's ichor, trembled as she unscrewed the cap. The acrid smell of the fuel, sharp and clean, cut through the cloying stench of decay. She didn't aim. She didn't have time. She simply flung the contents of the can in a wide, desperate arc, dousing the reanimated Arthur. Rasping sound of displeasure escaping its desiccated lips. Then, Elara remembered the matches in her coat pocket, put there earlier that day for lighting the gas stove. A mundane act from a world that now seemed a distant dream. Her fingers, clumsy with terror, fumbled for the small box. She struck one, the tiny flare of light a beacon in the oppressive gloom. With a prayer that was more a curse, a sob caught in her throat, she tossed the burning match towards the kerosene-soaked horrors. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. With a sudden, violent whoosh, the reanimated Arthur erupted into a pillar of searing flame, its tattered burial suit igniting like tinder. A silent, terrible scream seemed to emanate from the heart of the inferno, the phosphorescence turning into a sickly, bubbling incandescence. The Icarus robin thing sizzled and popped, the black slime igniting with a disgusting, oily smoke. The heat was intense, pushing Elara back, searing her face, the roar of the flames a deafening, cleansing sound. The reanimated Arthur staggered, its burning arms flailing, before collapsing into a heap of blazing, contorted limbs. The pip thing thrashed and burned, its sorrowful moans turning into agonized, inhuman screeches before it, too, fell still, a smoldering fungal pyre. The Icarus mass of the robin simply melted, consumed by the flames, until only a blackened, greasy stain remained on the scorched earth. The elongated squirrel abomination, untouched by the initial blast of kerosene, screeched in what sounded like rage or terror and darted away, disappearing into the deeper shadows of the cemetery. A streak of gray against the flickering orange light. Miss Annabelle, the porcelain doll, who had remained just outside the arc of the kerosene, floated silently for a moment, its painted eyes reflecting the inferno. Then, with a faint, dry whisper that was lost in the roar of the flames, it too retreated, vanishing amongst the weathered tombstones. Elara stood, panting, the spade clutched in her hand like a talisman, watching the pyre of her reanimated husband and his grotesque cohort. The flames leaped and danced, consuming the last vestiges of their unnatural existence, the smoke acrid and choking. It was a scene of terrible, Pyrrhic victory, a desperate act of love and destruction. She had saved Arthur, or at least what remained of his memory, from an eternity of unholy undeath. But at what cost? As the flames began to die down, leaving behind smoldering, blackened remains and the stench of burnt everything, Elara became aware of a presence. Midnight, he was perched on a nearby mausoleum, a sleek black silhouette against the dying embers, his luminous green eyes reflecting the fading firelight. He watched the inferno with a cold, dispassionate, almost clinical interest. There was no anger in his gaze, no surprise, no sorrow. Only that same ancient, knowing, and utterly chilling detachment. He had orchestrated this entire symphony of horrors, and now he was observing its fiery, chaotic finale as if it were merely an interesting, if somewhat messy, experiment. As the last embers flickered and died, casting St. Augustine's cemetery into a deeper, more profound darkness, midnight rose, stretched languidly, and then, with a final, unreadable glance at Elara, he turned and melted into the deepest shadows of the night, disappearing as silently and enigmatically as he had first arrived in her life. He was gone. For now. The aftermath was a scene of quiet desolation. St. Augustine's cemetery was scorched. No doubt had seen the flames. She dropped the spade, her body trembling with exhaustion and a bone-deep weariness that went far beyond the physical. She had faced the abyss and, somehow, survived. But the scars, she knew, would remain forever. She was left in the chilling silence of her home, the absence of her husband, now a doubly profound, doubly agonizing wound. The horrors in the attic were gone, consumed or dispersed, but their taint lingered. Is the horror truly over? Or has midnight, the harbinger of sorrows, the soul stealer's cat, merely moved on, seeking another lonely soul, another grief-stricken heart to comfort with his terrible, unholy gifts? The question hung in the cold, empty rooms of her house, unanswered, a chilling echo of the grimoire's final, despairing lines. The final scene, a silent, knowing wink to the audience, would show a sleek black cat, identical in every way to midnight, appearing on the rain-swept doorstep of a recently widowed man in a distant, unfamiliar town, its luminous green eyes gleaming with ancient promise, a soft, deep purr beginning to rumble in its chest as the unsuspecting man, his face etched with fresh sorrow, opens the door. And there you have it, the chilling conclusion to Mrs. Weatherly's Black Cat. A tale of grief, of loss, and of the terrifying things that can answer when sorrow calls out into the darkness. I hope it sent a shiver or two down your spine. If you enjoyed this journey into Blackwood Creek, please do hit that like button, leave a comment below with your thoughts. What do you think happened to the squirrel and Miss Annabelle? And where will midnight strike next? And most importantly, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Eli Nightfall channel for more original horror stories, full audiobooks, and explorations into the macabre. Your support helps keep the nightmares alive. Until next time, try to sleep well, if you can.